This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Dahlia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halper.
Every week we discuss books and ideas and things that we find interesting. If you like us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out about us on our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review.
Our guest today is Rabbi Dr Tal Sessler. He is the author of 4 books in continental philosophy and contemporary Jewish identity. He is the senior rabbi of the Sephardic Temple in Los Angeles and the incoming dean of the Rabbinical School at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California, where he also serves as a professor of Jewish philosophy. Today we're going to discuss his book, Leibowitz and Levinas, Between Judaism and Universalism, that came out in Hebrew in 2008 and is forthcoming in English. The book is a comparative examination of the political and theological thought of 2 contemporary, highly regarded Orthodox philosophers whose writings engaged with the Jewish condition in the 20th century against the backdrop of modernity and the changing world order. Tal Sessler is now joining us on the line from sunny California. Hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gilad, and thank you, Dahlia. It's a blessing and a joy to be with you. Thank you both for inviting me.
What an uplifting opening. Let's talk about some uplifting ideas now.
Exactly, that's exactly what we're here for. So, by way of introduction, can you tell us really how radical was the notion of discussing Leibowitz and Levinas together?
It's a very good starting point, I think, for our discussion, because on the face of it, they seem to be at loggerheads with one another. Leibowitz was a neo-Maimonidean theologian, which means in simpler English that he was a staunch rationalist, and Levinas Levinas was also an heir to the Lithuanian rationalist tradition, but they ended up pursuing 2 different paths. And Leibowitz kind of divorced morality from religion, and Levinas saw the ethical as the prime and focal point of religious life. So on the face of it, they went in very different directions. But when you take a closer look at their work, you see that there are pervasive political and theological affinities between those 2 seminal thinkers whose influence on contemporary Jewish thought is quite incalculable. Even though Leibowitz, he was a Socratic figure in Israel, he's not as well known in the North American Jewish landscape. Levinas has much more of a universal recognition than Leibowitz obtained thus far.
And do you think that has something to do with the very deep controversy that Leibowitz has generated, through his political opinions? And I think this taps into something that I do see as one of the differences between them, which is that Leibowitz is so concerned with earthly affairs and hardcore politics and makes political predictions, whereas you describe Levinas as much more engaged in the metaphysical world, almost transcendental. Is that what led Leibowitz to these extremely controversial opinions that he became famous for and maybe cut him out a little bit of influence outside of his controversial reputation in Israel?
Sure. I mean, one can say that Leibowitz for sure was the enfant terrible, right? The quintessential provocateur from the left side of the political spectrum in Israel. He had Leibowitz, let's put it this way, Leibowitz was what we call in Hebrew a navi tochecha, a prophet of rebuke to political Israel, especially in the aftermath of 1967. He did the demographic arithmetic, if you like, and he realized that it's not going to be tenable to maintain control over millions of people and have Israel's moral and ethical stature remain unscathed, if you like. And Levinas was not a prophet of rebuke, rather he was a prophet of consolation for French Jewry and European Jewry after the Holocaust. And of course, Levinas himself was a Holocaust survivor, and he survived the Holocaust by virtue of being in in a POW camp with fellow French officers during World War II, and that's what enabled him to survive. Leibowitz, some people are not aware of this. Leibowitz, in his youth, actually believed that the forthcoming state of Israel could also have religious significance, the contemporarization of halakha and Jewish law to the state apparatus. However, when he saw what in his eyes was the unholy alliance between religion and political messianism in Israel, he quickly became a minimalist Zionist. And his Zionism was, in a word, reduced to one sentence, which he wrote once to a European whom he corresponded with. He said, Zionism took place because, and I'm quoting Leibowitz now, because we were tired of being ruled by the Gentiles. That's Leibovitz's words. So, Leibowitz used very harsh and controversial rhetoric, but it was a very well thought out oratory strategy, if you like. He wanted to, as in the words of Isaiah in the Bible, lehar'id et amot hasipim, he wanted to shake the very foundations of Israeli society, to wake it up from its dogmatic slumbers politically, to borrow from Immanuel Kant. And that's the reason Leibowitz used such harsh rhetoric. He wanted to shock people because the looming ramifications of the occupation of the West Bank, in his eyes, was disastrous for the Jewish state and for Jewish religious life.
Can you maybe elaborate a bit on his change of heart regarding Zionism? Because I, for one, did not know that he was really a run-of-the-mill Zionist in his early days.
I don't know if run-of-the-mill is fair.
I don't know if run-of-the-mill, but maybe not as controversial or perhaps, external figure that he was in these latter days. And, having read your book and much of what you say about both men's commitment to universalism, each in their own way, led them to oppose, in a way, the politicization of religion. And what is Zionism, if not the politicization of religion in one way or another? So what really drew Leibowitz to Zionism in the first place, if his philosophical or perhaps theological view was so markedly opposed?
So I'll start with a very telling and poignant and, in my view, fascinating anecdote recounted by Leibowitz in his writings. He said that he once met with David Ben-Gurion well after the state was established, well after the state of Israel was already a fait accompli, and he was polemicizing with Ben-Gurion. And Leibowitz was advocating the separation of religion and state in the state of Israel. And Ben-Gurion listened to him very attentively. And when Leibowitz was done with his stormy monologue, Ben-Gurion answered him, responded succinctly in the Hebrew, and said the Hebrew analogous of, I understand very well, Professor Leibowitz, why you want to sever the Gordian knot between religion and state in Israel. And it is precisely for that reason that I do not want to do so. In other words, Leibowitz understood, to quote Lord Acton, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that the monopoly of ultra-Orthodoxy over religious life in Israel contaminates, if to use a harsh word, the vibrancy and the authenticity and the spiritual vigor of religious life in Israel. So to answer your question more directly, it was in the 1950s that Leibowitz realized that on the ground, Israel is an utterly secular political endeavor seeking to alleviate the political plight of world Jewry in the aftermath of genocide of the Holocaust. And then he became a Zionist pragmatist, if you like, due to the geopolitical contingencies of life and the Jewish condition. And to use a quote by the celebrated American poet Robert Frost once wrote, home is where they have to let you in. And that was Leibovitz's Zionism. Israel is a refuge for world Jewry after 2 millennia of constant persecution culminating in genocide in the diaspora. And that's what made him unique, because the bulk of the modern Orthodox world in Israel, especially in the post-67 realities, created a Gordian knot between geopolitics and theology, the followers of Rav Kook. And Leibowitz was, as you know, the public in Israel knows quite well, was a solitary voice, staunchly opposing that unholy alliance between the political and the theological in post-Six-Day War Israel.
And where does Levinas come into the picture? With his milder support for Israel, yet still he was a supporter of Israel, even though he chose to settle in France after the war, and he was a great admirer of French philosophical tradition or continental philosophical tradition in general. And on the face of it, he had every good reason to oppose Zionism, yet he didn't.
Right. Levinas was a pan-European. You know, Levinas was born in Lithuania, and he moved to France at the age of 17 or 18, and out of sheer ideological and cultural affinity to French culture and French civilization, and its promise, the French secular promise that one can become a French citizen, and I'm quoting Levinas here, not only by ethnic grounds, but also by way of cultural affinity. And he chose Europe. Levinas chose to remain in Europe also after the Holocaust. And he was a supporter of pragmatic Zionism. He said that the text is always holier than the soil. In other words, the core of Jewish identity is to be found in sacred textuality rather than in the territories, if you like, in the soil of Israel. And he was sometimes, he had to keep himself more humble, even when he had certain misgivings. Let's say after the Sabra and Shatila massacre during the First Lebanon War. Because as a Jew residing in the diaspora, he felt that he doesn't have the moral stature or the moral standing, if you like, to vehemently criticize Israel. He supported Israel. He appreciated Israel. He visited Israel. He actually taught at Hebrew University at some point with his anachronistic rabbinic Hebrew. And his main endeavor, Levinas's main endeavor, is to build an ethics, a universal ethics after Auschwitz. Because what happened in Auschwitz and what also happened in the Stalinist gulags, the Soviet concentration camps, is that people were not being seen as unique individuals in God's image, if you like, as irreducible entities, as distinct human beings. People were looked at under the guise of ethnic grounds, under Nazi racialism. And under Stalinism, people were looked at according to their socioeconomic class. And Levinas wanted to return us to an ethics which sees the irreducible and non-negotiable human dignity inherent in every human individual. And that, for Levinas, is embodied, if you like, in the human face. Every human face is utterly unique. There's a beautiful midrash that says that when a human being mints a coin, let's say $quarter, they all come out the same, perfectly identical. But when God Almighty mints a visage, a human face, each one emerges utterly distinct, unique, and distinguished. So the face for Levinas embodies and exclaims the sixth commandment of the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not commit murder." And much of his work is to return us, or Western civilization, to a philosophy that sees the sheer individual humanity of every human being after Europe lost itself in the abstractions of ethnicity and socioeconomic class, and lost the ability to to have a conscience and to see human beings in their irreducible essence. And to just augment one more point, startlingly enough, it was only after World War II when a Jewish diplomat by the name of Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide. That word did not exist, so much so that chillingly, Winston Churchill alluded in the early 40s to the massacre en masse of Eastern European Jewry in the forests of Europe as a crime that has no name, a crime that has no name. So Levinas's ethics and theology is a response to genocide in general and the Holocaust of a third of the Jewish people in particular. And there was a German philosopher called Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger is considered one of the leading existential thinkers of the 20th century, thinking about what it means to lead a worthy and authentic existence on the individual level. And Heidegger was a great genius. His masterpiece is called Sein und Zeit, Being and Time, published in Germany in 1927. And Levinas was a big fan of Heidegger.
Well, I want to stop you for a second. I mean, I want, before, just to prompt you, because I see you're going this direction, and really what I wanted to ask you is why it was that you located so much of Levinas's thought in the post-Auschwitz era, when it seems like you have attributed his formative development and maybe formative turning points to his experiences with Heidegger and, you know, the disillusionment that he went through in the 1930s, given Heidegger's process. Now, I just wanted to say that to, you know, to sort of guide your telling of this story.
Yes, thank you for this, Dalia. I think that, you know, Levinas's philosophy, and I, for what it's worth, believe that every philosophy is a fusion of biography and intellect, that a worthwhile philosophy stands the test of time, but it's also what Hegel called Zeitdiagnose, which means a diagnosis of the time. So Levinas, on the one hand, had those intellectual influences that I started talking about, but he also experienced the Holocaust on his very flesh. He was for years a POW, as I mentioned before, during World War II, and he was subjected to very harsh labor, forced labor, and his wife and daughter were hidden by a fellow author in Paris whose name was Maurice Blanchot. He was hiding Levinas's wife and daughter during the Holocaust, and that's how they survived. So to hopefully answer your question, Dalia, Levinas's work is a fusion of his own survival of the Holocaust and his spouse and child survival of the Holocaust, learning about the magnitude and the scope of the genocide, and having seen the betrayal of some of Europe's and specifically German intellectuals of human and humane values during the days of the Nazi era. So these things are intertwined. As we say in Hebrew, they are kelim shluvim. Levinas's intellectual philosophical work and his own biography and survival of the Holocaust cannot be severed from one another. They're both foundational to understanding his life and thought.
And what would you say about his relationship with Heidegger? Because he was a great admirer of Heidegger, as you point out in the book. He was greatly influenced by him. And then, of course, Heidegger shortly thereafter became the most prominent Nazi intellectual. And after the war, Levinas said that Germans in general can be forgiven, but not Heidegger. And, drawing on what you just said about thought being a combination of intellect and experience, how would you say his influence by Heidegger evolved over the years from this great admiration to disillusionment?
It's a very deep question. Thank you, Gilad. I think that what happened with Levinas, first of all, I'll say Levinas was the opposite of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt unilaterally forgave Heidegger after the war and became friends with him again. And Levinas swore that he will never set foot in Germany again. And when he was honored by Heidelberg University for his philosophical enterprise, he sent his son to receive the prize and the award in absentia. He didn't want to set foot on German soil again. So, in a word, to try and answer your question, Gilad, Heidegger celebrated my personal striving for a life of meaning and authenticity. And what Levinas understood after the war is that in the age of genocide, we need to focus more on the human being facing me rather than on my own spiritual and existential growth and vigor. And so Heidegger wrote a lot about how do I live an authentic, worthy life, but he wrote very little about being with others, in German, Mitsein. He didn't write much about that. And Levinas decided that the most important thing that European thought and the European condition needs after the Holocaust, in the age of genocide, is to build an ethics of infinite responsibility to the person facing me now in utter vulnerability and helplessness. That was for him the agenda, not the fixation of the authenticity of self, a la Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, but rather my responsibility for you in what he called the face-to-face encounter with a fellow human being.
That reminds me a little bit of Martin Buber. Was he influenced by Martin Buber as well?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Absolutely. What Buber's chief contribution, in my eyes, in my humble opinion, is that basically we human beings have two modes of interpersonal encounters. One is transactional, what Buber called the I-it relationships. And the other one is a soulful encounter with a fellow human being, which he called I-thou. Two very different things. And with Buber, the soulful encounter with another human being, the I-thou, is symmetrical. You know, you and I are having a deep, authentic, vulnerable, sacred conversation about life, if you like. And it's symmetrical. We're both there with each other. But for Levinas, it's asymmetrical in the sense that the other is above me. I am here to serve the other, to salvage the other, to be attuned to the plights of the other. So with Buber, the face-to-face encounter is symmetrical, two souls having some sort of a soulful encounter. With Levinas, I am here for the other. He used to quote a word from the Torah, which appears several times, including before the binding of Isaac, and that word is hineni. In French, me voici, here I am. He said that his whole philosopher can be summarized in what you say to a fellow person in French when you open the door for them, après vous, after you. So with Levinas, the other comes first. And we have to remember that this is written after the Holocaust, after people did not see the other human being as a distinct human essence. Let us remember that in the camps, people were not looked on in the face. People were not called by their first name. People were reduced to a serial number engraved on their arms, and that's how they were called. So on the face of it, Levinas's philosophy is very esoteric, kind of ivory tower. But when you look closer at the political and historical experiences that Levinas is contending with, then you understand that Levinas's philosophy is deeply rooted in the most foundational experiences of humanity in the 20th century.
Okay, I want to bring the discussion back a little bit to their concepts of religion, because I think in the beginning, when you're explaining why you juxtapose these two thinkers, You argue that both of them remained committed to a conception of Judaism and even religious Judaism that was, and I'm quoting in free translation here, a modern enlightened religious paradigm that remained loyal to modern values such as liberalism and humanism. Now, this raises to me, a whole sort of Pandora's box of questions, but let's just start with the word enlightened. In my ears today, in 2021, it's hard to use that term without normative connotations. So what do you mean when you write about their perception of an enlightened religious paradigm?
What I mean by that is that even though Leibowitz, it would ruin his whole day if I would call him a humanist, because for him, humanism was about putting the human person at the focal point of life rather than God.
Well, I think you make it clear that he's theocentric.
Right, absolutely. But both, to use a term by Levinas, Leibowitz was also concerned about the humanism of the other person. And he wanted to sever religion from morality, but really he didn't. For example, when he criticized the IDF for an action that took away dozens of lives, the Kibia operation in the 50s, he used the story of how Jacob's two sons, Simon and Levi, slaughtered the entire male inhabitants of the city of Shechem in the Torah. So he always he did in factuality make a connection between religiosity and having a moral compass and a moral conscience. But to go back specifically to your question, what I'm trying to say by the word enlightenment is I'm talking enlightenment as a philosophical and political movement that started in the 1700s, chiefly in France and Germany, and the movement that really brought about the secularization of the West. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Diderot and Voltaire and Immanuel Kant in Germany, for example, these seminal thinkers, they paved the path to secular representative democracy and to human rights. And unfortunately, in my humble opinion, there is a pervasive paucity of vocal, titanic intellectuals in the Orthodox Jewish world today who are preaching both foundational sermons. Sermon 1, be a Jew staunchly committed to Jewish life spiritually and religiously, and at the same time be an adherent of the Enlightenment political virtues of democracy and human rights. And Leibowitz and Levinas did personify that. And we don't see too much of that today. And I can't resist to make a contemporary remark that if we look today at the people who are at the top of the list of the religious Zionist party to become members of Knesset, and the kind of internal coalition in the Zionist religious party today, then you see the appalling absence of a Gordian knot between religious faith, religious practice, and having a political universal conscience and orientation. But Levinas and Leibowitz had that.
Okay, so you really have raised, I think, what to my mind is one of the most interesting and troubling questions raised by your book. Let's see if I can say this succinctly. I mean, the fact is the attempt to merge religious thinking or retain within Jewish religious thinking a universalist sense of human rights dedication, a liberal sense of the value of each individual in Israel has not been a great success. Now, I'm speaking as a political analyst, and the evidence and the survey data shows time and again that the religious communities very consistently are less supportive of those kinds of values, and the secular communities are more supportive. I'm not even judging it, but it's a very long-standing finding. And as you pointed out with this very illustrative, topical example about the religious Zionist party, they are kind of the culmination of that. Even their name, they claim to represent religious Zionism and stand for any number of different kinds of chauvinist political approaches. So I guess my question is, if these were the greatest minds of their generation, trying to advance a concept of committed religious Judaism with universalist human rights and liberal thinking, and it didn't work in Israel, maybe it's not possible. What would you say to that?
Look, I think we're hitting a very sore point, and I'm going to quote a verse from the book of Lamentations in the Bible in Hebrew. Al ele ani bochia. For these things I weep. And it's true that if we look at the most seminal worldly Jewish theologians, then by and large, most of them resided in the diaspora. I'm thinking Abram Joshua Heschel, who marched arm to arm with Dr. King, and he said, when I marched in Selma, my feet were praying. I'm thinking about Rabbi Professor Soloveitchik, the greatest modern Orthodox theologian the 20th century had known, who refused to be the chief Ashkenazi rabbi in Israel, saying he doesn't want to be subjugated to the state apparatus. I'm thinking about Levinas himself, and it's a very sordid reality that religious Zionism became reduced to and synonymous with the territorial question of the West Bank, rather than questions of human rights and human dignity, tikkun olam, social welfare. This is in my eyes, a tragedy. And as you pointed out, Dalia, I said at the beginning of the book that I believe that Leibowitz and Levinas salvaged some of the universal dignity of modern orthodoxy in recent times.
So you're saying that it's not impossible, that it's just, the circumstances that are problematic here.
Not only is it not impossible, as it says in Parshat Nitzavim, which is a parsha we always read in the Shabbat preceding Rosh Hashanah, it says in the Torah, Lo b'shamayim, it is not in heaven. It is not some far-fetched ideal. However, to find people who are both theologically ingenious and politically humanistic is exceedingly rare. The greatest personification of this ideal was the late and righteous Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, whom I was blessed and privileged to know, who was tragically taken away from us at the age of 72 last November. So my one sentence answer to you, dear Gilad, if I may, is that it's not impossible, but it is reflected in the final sentence of Spinoza's Ethics. The final sentence of Spinoza's Ethics reads the following: everything that is worthwhile is as difficult as it is rare. And to find someone who is a spiritual giant and is imbued with towering, universal, humane conscience is very rare indeed.
You know, I've been looking in the Knesset for that person, and I just can't find him.
Not within a 100-kilometer radius. Tal, we are running out of time, so maybe one last question, unless something else crops up. Sure. About these two titans again. You did say in the book that they never met. Right. Did they recognize each other's towering contribution to philosophy, both Jewish and universal?
Yes, absolutely. The seminal essays of Levinas on Judaism is called, in French, Difficile Liberté, Difficult Freedom, available both in Hebrew and in English, of course. And Levinas makes an allusion to Dr. Leibowitz in one of his essays, in very favorable tones. And to reciprocate, unknowingly, Leibowitz also said, when asked in a book of conversations with Michael Sassar, published in Hebrew, he said that the works of Levinas are amongst the most original and worthy Jewish philosophical writings of our time. So they did know of each other and appreciated each other's work. And I want to almost end, if I may, on a semi-humorous note. Dalia said she's looking for such towering individuals in the Knesset, and I cynically retorted, good luck to you. So it is said that when Dr. Henry Kissinger, may he live and be well, left Harvard University, where he was a professor, to become national security advisor for Nixon, a journalist asked Kissinger, why did you leave Harvard? And Kissinger promptly responded, because I was tired of politics.
Yeah.
Well, I have to top that and say that the world's best social singer-songwriter Tom Lehrer once joked about Kissinger that humor and satire became superfluous after Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
That's another perspective. I hear you totally.
Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation. We're very happy to have been able to speak to you, Rabbi Dr. Tal Sessler, speaking about your book, Leibowitz and Levinas, Between Judaism and Universalism. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to converse with you both. And I hope we'll be in touch, please God. And thank you for inviting me to your wonderful show.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, TLV1's studio manager. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Make sure to be very honest. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 600 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad on Twitter, and definitely join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.